Every morning at 8:15, Richard Callum stepped out of his black car, straightened his jacket, and walked through the brass-framed doors of Callum Financial Tower without looking left or right. Not at the doorman who held the door, not at the receptionist who said good morning, not at the dozens of employees who parted instinctively when they saw him coming, the way water parts around something heavy and fast-moving. Richard Callum had built a $2 billion empire on the principle that attention was currency, and he would not spend a single cent of it on anything that didn't generate a return. He was not cruel in the dramatic sense. He didn't shout. He didn't humiliate. He simply treated the world beyond his interests as though it did not exist. And for 51 years, the world had largely allowed him to get away with it. But every morning for 2 years, without fail, there was a man sitting on the steps of the building next door. An old man, thin, white-haired, with a paper cup and a folded blanket and the particular stillness of someone who has made peace with being invisible. He never called out to Richard, never held up a sign, never made eye contact or reached toward passing pedestrians with the desperate energy that Richard associated with people asking for things. He simply sat quietly, with a dignity that was, when you actually looked at it, faintly unsettling. Richard never looked at it. For 2 years, he walked past that man every single morning and every single evening and registered him the way you register a parking meter or a fire hydrant as an object that occupied space without relevance. His assistant Caroline had once mentioned the man in passing something about whether the building management could ask him to move, and Richard had said, "Not our steps, not our problem," without looking up from his phone. That was the end of it. Until the Tuesday morning in March, when Richard stepped out of his car, straightened his jacket, and the steps next door were empty. He noticed immediately. That was the thing that surprised him, how immediately he noticed. He stopped walking for just a fraction of a second, 1 foot still mid-stride, before recovering and continuing through the brass doors. But the pause happened, and the pause bothered him, because it meant that on some level he had been registering the old man every morning, had been measuring the world against his presence without ever consciously acknowledging it. The empty steps followed Richard into the elevator and up to his 38th floor office and sat across from him while he went through his morning briefing with Caroline and didn't leave when he started his first call of the day. By noon, he had looked out his window at the steps 3 times. By 3 o'clock, he had done something he had not done in longer than he could remember. He had wondered about another person. Not what they wanted from him, not what they were worth, just where they were, whether they were all right. It was such an unfamiliar sensation that he sat with it for a moment, puzzled by his own discomfort, before pushing back from his desk and telling Caroline he was stepping out for 20 minutes. She stared at him. Richard Callum did not step out in the middle of the afternoon. Richard Callum did not step out without a destination and a scheduled purpose. "Is everything all right?" she asked. 20 minutes, he said, and walked to the elevator. What he found when he started asking questions about the old man on the steps would take everything Richard Callum thought he knew about success, value, and the cost of looking away and quietly, completely, permanently dismantle it. Richard started with the building's doorman, a heavyset man named Frank, who had been stationed at the entrance of the neighboring building for 11 years and who looked genuinely startled when Richard Callum approached him directly and asked about the old man who usually sat on the bed steps. Frank studied Richard for a moment with the careful expression of someone deciding how much to say to someone they have never trusted. Then he said, "You mean Henry. You know his name?" "Known Henry for 2 years," Frank said simply. "He's a decent man, quiet, never bothered anyone." "Where is he?" Richard asked. "He wasn't here this morning." Frank's expression shifted into something more guarded. "Henry was taken to St. Matthew's Hospital 4 days ago. Hypothermia. The temperature dropped hard last week and Frank paused. He didn't have anywhere warm to go. Richard stood on the pavement outside Frank's building in his $2,000 coat and felt something move through him that he did not immediately have a name for. "Is he all right?" "Don't know," Frank said. "I'm not family. They won't tell me much." He looked at Richard with a directness that most people were too intimidated to use with him. "You walked past Henry every day for 2 years. Mr. Callum, I've watched you do it. Why do you care now that he's gone?" It was a fair question. Richard didn't have a good answer for it. He said, "I don't know," which was the most honest thing he had said to another person in a considerable amount of time, and walked back to his building. He lasted until 4:30 before he told Caroline to find out which ward Henry was in at St. Matthew's Hospital. Caroline, who had worked for Richard for 9 years and prided herself on being unshockable, took a moment before she wrote it down. Then she found the information in 11 minutes and put it on his desk without comment. Richard looked at the paper for a long time. Then he put it in his jacket pocket and went back to his calls. That evening, instead of going directly to his car, he walked 3 blocks to Street Matthews. He told himself he was going because the empty steps were distracting him and resolving the distraction was a matter of productivity. He told himself this firmly and without irony, and almost believed it. Street Matthews was a public hospital, underfunded, overworked, with the particular smell of institutions that are doing their best with not enough. Richard had not been inside a public hospital since he was 19 years old. He followed signs to the ward. The paper listed and spoke to a nurse at the station who looked at him with the flat, assessing tiredness of someone who had been on shift for 10 hours and had no energy left for being impressed by expensive clothing. "Henry Walsh," he said. I know him. I wanted to check on him." The nurse checked her computer. "Room 12. He's stable. He can have visitors for 15 minutes. She looked at Richard. "Are you family?" "No," Richard said. She studied him for a second. "He doesn't get many visitors," she said in a tone that managed to be both informational and quietly accusatory. "Room 12. 15 minutes." Henry Walsh was smaller than Richard had realized. On the steps, he had always seemed not large exactly, but substantial somehow. Present. In the hospital bed, he looked like something the cold had tried to take apart. He was connected to a drip, and his hands on the blanket were thin and mapped with veins, and his white hair was flatter without the wool cap Richard had always seen him wearing. But his eyes, when he opened them and found Richard Callum standing in the doorway of his hospital room, were completely alert, dark and clear, and carrying the particular depth of someone who has had a great deal of time to think. He looked at Richard for a moment. Then he said, in a voice roughened but steady, "You're the man from the tower." Richard stepped inside. "Yes." "You never looked at me," Henry said. "Not accusatory, just factual, the way you state the weather." Richard pulled the chair beside the bed and sat down something he realized, as he did it, that he hadn't done in someone else's space in a very long time. He always stood. Standing kept conversations short and control clear. Sitting was different. Sitting said he was staying for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't." Henry watched him with those clear eyes. "What changed?" "You weren't there this morning." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face. "So it took me disappearing for you to see me." Richard didn't answer because there was no answer that didn't confirm it entirely. Henry shifted slightly against his pillow. "Why did you come here, Mr. Callum?" "Richard Callum." "Why did you come here, Mr. Callum?" It was the same question Frank had asked in different words. Richard looked at the man in the bed, this old man he had walked past for 2 years without a single thought, and said, "I honestly don't know. I needed to know you were all right." Henry looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "That's the most human thing I've heard from someone in a suit in a very long time." He closed his eyes briefly, tiredly. "I'm stable, they tell me. I'll be out in a few days. Back to the steps, I suppose, if Frank's building management doesn't use this as an excuse to move me on." "Where do you sleep?" Richard asked. "When it gets cold. Wherever I can find," Henry said simply. "There's a shelter on Merchant Street, but it fills up fast when the temperature drops. Last week I was too late. By the time I got there," he stopped, opened his eyes again. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy, Mr. Callum. I'm just answering your question." "I know," Richard said, and he did know. Because Henry Walsh had not, in 2 years on those steps, ever asked him for a single thing. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "How did you end up?" Richard paused. It was a rude question, and he knew it. But Henry seemed unsurprised by it. "How did I end up on the steps outside your building?" He said it without sharpness. "That's a longer story than 15 minutes allows." He looked at the ceiling. "Come back tomorrow if you want to hear it. I'm not going anywhere." Richard stood up. He straightened his jacket, automatically the habit of a man who is always about to be seen by someone who matters. Then he caught himself doing it and felt, for the first time in a long time, slightly ridiculous. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said. Henry nodded, already closing his eyes, already retreating back into the exhausted sleep of someone whose body had been through something serious. "Good night, Mr. Callum," he said quietly. "Good night, Henry," Richard said, and walked back out through the hospital corridors into the cold night air, where his car was waiting and his driver was standing by the door, and the whole familiar machinery of his life was exactly where he had left it. But something was different. Something small and structural had shifted, the way a single stone shifts in a wall, and suddenly the whole thing is slightly different, even though nothing visible has changed yet. Richard came back the next day. And the day after that, on the third visit, Henry told him the longer story, in the measured, unhurried way of someone who has had a long time to make peace with the facts of his own life. Henry Walsh had not always been on those steps. 20 years ago, he had been a civil engineer with a small but respected firm, a house in the suburbs, a wife named Ruth, and a son named James who was studying architecture and called home every Sunday. He had been, by any reasonable measure, a man who had built something solid. Not wealthy, not powerful, but solid. Then the firm he worked for took a contract with a large developer, a contract that turned out to involve materials, fraud, structural shortcuts, corner cutting on a scale that Henry had not known about until a building they had certified collapsed during construction and 3 workers were killed. The investigation that followed swept up everyone connected to the project. Henry had done nothing wrong. The fraud had been concealed from him deliberately by partners who knew he wouldn't sanction it, but his name was on certifications and the legal process was long and expensive and brutal. By the time he was fully cleared, he had spent everything on legal fees. The firm was dissolved. His professional reputation was attached to a disaster, even though his name had been cleared. Ruth had gotten sick during the proceedings, the stress, the financial collapse, the relentlessness of it, and died before the clearance came through. James had tried to help, but was young and just starting out, and there was only so much a young man could do against the momentum of that much loss at once. Henry had ended up on the street not through addiction, not through recklessness, not through any of the failures that people preferred to assign to people in his situation, because those explanations were more comfortable. He had ended up there through a precise combination of injustice, bad timing, and the simple, brutal arithmetic of loss piling up faster than recovery could keep pace with. He had been on those steps for 2 years. He was 68 years old. He was not defeated. That was the word Richard kept coming back to later, turning it over in his mind. Henry Walsh was not defeated. He was weathered. There was a difference. Richard listened to all of it without interrupting. When Henry finished, the room was quiet. The developer, Richard said carefully, the one whose project collapsed. Who was it? Henry looked at him. A company called Graymont Development, run by a man named Stuart Vane. He paused. You know him? Richard's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, because, yes, he knew Stuart Vane. Not well, not personally, but in the way that men at a certain financial level knew each other through boardrooms and industry events and the overlapping circles of money and influence. Stuart Vane had rebuilt Graymont after the scandal with remarkable speed and was currently one of the larger players in the city's commercial development sector. He had, as far as Richard had ever been aware, faced no lasting consequences for the collapse that had killed 3 workers and destroyed Henry Walsh's life. I know of him, Richard said. Henry nodded slowly. He's done well for himself, he said without bitterness. Just fact. Men like that usually do. Richard sat with that for a moment. Then he said, Henry, when you're discharged, where are you planning to go? Henry looked at him steadily. Back to the steps, Mr. Callum. Same as before. No, Richard said. The word came out more firmly than he had planned. He sat forward slightly. I have a property, a service department building on Grant Street corporate lets, mostly empty right now between tenants. I want you to stay there while we figure out something more permanent. Henry studied him for a long time. Why? It was the simplest and most difficult question Richard had been asked in years. He thought about giving a clean answer, something about wanting to help, something that sounded generous and resolved. But Henry Walsh had spent 2 years being looked through by this man and deserved better than a clean answer. Because I walked past you for 2 years, Richard said slowly, and I'm going to have to live with that. And I'd rather start doing something about it than keep sitting with it. Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I won't take charity, Mr. Callum. It's not charity, Richard said. Consider it 2 years of back rent on the steps. Henry looked at him, and for the first time, the beginning of a smile became an actual smile. Small, measured, but real. Richard Callum had not built a $2 billion empire by being slow when he decided to move. Within 72 hours of leaving Henry's hospital room, he had his legal team pulling every publicly available document connected to Graymont Development and Stuart Vane. What they found in the first week was enough to make his senior attorney put down his coffee cup and say very carefully, Richard, This is bigger than we thought. The building collapse 20 years ago had been investigated. A report had been filed. That report had concluded that the materials fraud originated with a subcontractor and that Graymont's leadership had no prior knowledge. It was a clean conclusion, professionally written, thoroughly documented, and, as Richard's team began to discover, almost entirely constructed. The investigator who had written the report had been paid not directly, not obviously, but through a series of consulting fees routed through a subsidiary company that no longer existed by a holding entity connected to Stuart Vane. The subcontractor who had been assigned full blame had declared bankruptcy 6 months after the report and disappeared from the industry entirely. 2 of the 3 families of the workers who died had accepted settlements with strict non-disclosure agreements. The 3rd family had tried to pursue further legal action and had been buried under counter-litigation until they ran out of money and gave up. Henry Walsh had been cleared. But he had been cleared of something that should never have touched him in the first place because the fraud hadn't originated with the subcontractor at all. It had originated with Graymont, with Stuart Vane specifically, who had known about the material substitutions, had approved the cost savings, had signed off on certifications he knew were false, and had then spent a considerable amount of money making sure the investigation never found its way to his desk. 3 workers had died. Henry Walsh had lost everything. And Stuart Vane had rebuilt his company and attended industry galas and shaken hands with city officials and continued, for 20 years, to develop buildings across the city while the man whose life he had destroyed sat on the steps of a building and was walked past by people who didn't look down. Richard sat in his office on a Thursday evening after everyone else had gone home and read through the summary his legal team had prepared, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not the controlled, strategic anger he sometimes used as fuel in negotiations. Something older and simpler than that. Something that had no financial application and no strategic purpose. He was just angry. Cleanly and straightforwardly angry. The way a person is angry when they look at something wrong and decide they are no longer willing to look away from it. He picked up his phone and called a journalist he had known for 15 years, a woman named Patricia Horn, who wrote investigative pieces for a national publication and who had, on 3 separate occasions, asked Richard for information about figures in his industry that he had declined to provide because it wasn't his business. He had always respected her work even while declining to contribute to it. She picked up on the second ring. "Patricia," he said, "I have something. It's significant and it's documented and I want it done properly." There was a brief pause. "Richard Callum calling me voluntarily with a story," she said. "I've been waiting for this for 15 years. Talk to me." Henry was discharged from Street Matthews on a Friday morning. Richard sent a car, not his own car, not something that would overwhelm, just a clean, quiet car driven by a calm driver who helped Henry with the single bag that contained everything he owned in the world. The apartment on Grant Street was small and warm and had a window that looked out over a courtyard with a tree in it. Henry stood in the doorway for a moment when he first saw it. Then he walked to the window and looked at the tree for a long time without saying anything. Richard had stocked the kitchen himself, not through an assistant. He had gone to the grocery store on a Wednesday afternoon, something he had not done in perhaps 15 years, and walked the aisles with a list he had written by hand, buying things he thought a man who had been living outside in the cold might want. Soup, good bread, tea, fruit. Simple things. He had felt faintly absurd doing it and had done it anyway. Henry found the groceries and stood in the small kitchen for a moment with his hand on the counter. Then he turned and looked at Richard, who was leaning in the doorway, and said, "You went to the store yourself." "How can you tell?" "Because whoever did this shopping was guessing," Henry said, "and guessing kindly. That's not something you delegate." He looked back at the groceries. "Thank you, Mr. Callum." "Richard," he said, "please." Henry looked at him. "Richard," he said, and that was that. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Richard Callum's life that he could not have predicted and would not have chosen, and was grateful for in a way he didn't yet have proper language for. He visited Henry regularly, not out of obligation, but because Henry Walsh was, it turned out, one of the most interesting people Richard had ever encountered. He had read everything. He remembered everything. He had opinions about architecture and history and the ethics of urban development that were precise and unsentimental and frequently made Richard reconsider positions he had held for decades. He was also in the way of people who have genuinely suffered and come through it without bitterness, completely without pretension. He said what he thought. He asked what he wanted to know. He did not manage Richard or perform for him or position himself carefully the way almost everyone else in Richard's life did. Richard found himself, for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, simply enjoying another person's company. Patricia Horn's investigation, published 6 weeks after Richard's call. It ran across 3 days, a long, carefully sourced, extensively documented series that laid out the full architecture of what Stuart Vane had done. The falsified investigation, the paid-off investigator, the buried litigation, the workers who had died. Henry Walsh's name appeared in the second installment his story told with his permission, in his own words, with the clarity and dignity that characterized everything about him. The response was immediate and significant. The city's construction regulatory authority opened a formal investigation. 2 of Greymont's current development contracts were suspended pending review. The family that had been buried under counter-litigation, the Okafor family, whose son Marcus had been one of the 3 workers killed, came forward publicly for the first time in 18 years and were connected through Richard's legal team with attorneys who took their case on contingency. Stuart Vane released a statement through his PR firm calling the reporting misleading and agenda-driven that convinced no one and satisfied nothing. 3 months later, Stuart Vane was indicted on 4 counts of fraud, 2 counts of criminal negligence, and 1 count of obstruction of justice related to the original investigation. He stood outside a courthouse in an expensive suit, looking considerably smaller than he had at every industry gala Richard had ever seen him attend. The cold certainty that powerful men carry the assurance that consequences are for other people was simply gone from his face. What remained was just a man being asked, at last, to account for what he had done. Richard watched the coverage from his office. Then he turned off the screen and went back to work. Henry Walsh received a formal letter 4 months after Patricia's series ran. It was from the city's Civil Engineering Board, a body that had reviewed his case in light of the new evidence and had issued a public statement formally acknowledging that his professional reputation had been damaged by a fraudulent investigation and that his clearance record stood without qualification. It was not everything. It could not give back Ruth. It could not give back the 20 years. But it was something solid and official and true, and Henry held the letter for a long time before he put it carefully in the drawer of the small desk by the window. He also received, through the civil litigation that followed Stuart Vane's indictment, a settlement that was not enormous, but was real enough to remove the daily arithmetic of survival from his life permanently. He did not spend it on anything dramatic. He bought a good coat. He gave a portion to the Merchant Street shelter that had tried to take him in on the night the temperature dropped. He put the rest somewhere safe and continued living simply because simplicity, after everything, was what felt most honest. Richard quietly arranged for Henry to consult on a new initiative he was establishing, a review body for the structural certifications of affordable housing developments in the city. It was exactly the kind of work Henry had spent a career doing and the kind of oversight that might have prevented what Greymont had done if it had existed 20 years ago. Henry accepted because the work was real and necessary and because he was, underneath everything, still an engineer who cared about buildings being safe. They had lunch together every Thursday. It became a fixed thing, the kind of fixed thing that accumulates over time into something that both people would miss significantly if it stopped. Richard's assistant Caroline noted the Thursday lunches on his calendar without comment for the first month, and then on a Tuesday afternoon said to him, with the directness of 9 years of working closely with someone, "You seem different lately, Richard." "Better different. I just wanted to say that." Then she went back to her desk before he could respond, which was, he thought, exactly the right way to have said it. James Walsh Henry's son called his father more after the articles ran, then visited again. The distance that grief and crisis and the sheer weight of loss had built between them over 20 years did not disappear overnight, but it began, carefully and without force, to close. Henry mentioned it to Richard one Thursday over lunch in the understated way he mentioned everything significant. "James is coming next weekend," he said. "We're going to look at some photographs his mother kept. Things I haven't been able to look at for a long time." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm ready now." Richard nodded. He didn't say anything because nothing needed to be said. There is a kind of blindness that has nothing to do with the eyes. It is the blindness of a life lived entirely inside its own priorities, where the world narrows, gradually and without drama, to the boundaries of your own concerns. It happens slowly. It doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like focus. It feels like efficiency. It feels, most of the time, like simply being a serious person in a world that demands seriousness. And then one morning the steps are empty and you stop mid-stride and realize that somewhere along the way, without ever deciding to, you stop seeing people. Richard Callum did not become a different man after Henry Walsh. He was still precise, still demanding, still someone who moved through the world with the momentum of someone who had built something significant and knew it. But something had been added, or perhaps something had been returned some original capacity for seeing that had been buried under years of looking only at what was useful. He started noticing the doorman's name. He started asking his employees how they actually were and waiting for the actual answer. He started looking left and right when he walked through doors. Small things. They sound small when you list them, but they compound, and the people around him felt them compound. And the world that Richard moved through became, in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to miss, slightly warmer than it had been before. Henry Walsh had sat on those steps for 2 years and asked Richard Callum for nothing. Not a glance, not a dollar, not a moment of his time. And in asking for nothing, in simply being present and dignified and human in Richard's peripheral vision every single morning, he had given Richard something that no deal or acquisition or strategic triumph had ever managed to provide. He had given him a reason to stop walking so fast, a reason to look down, a reason to wonder about someone else's story. Sometimes the most important people in your life are the ones you almost walked past. Sometimes the most important moment is not the one you planned for or worked toward or saw coming. Sometimes it is an empty set of steps on a Tuesday morning in March and the unfamiliar, inconvenient, completely necessary feeling of wondering where someone went. Do not wait for the steps to be empty. Look now, while there is still time to see, while the person is still there and the moment is still available and the choice to be human is still yours to make without regret. Because the cost of looking is nothing. And the cost of not looking, as Richard Callum would tell you himself, on any given Thursday over lunch with an old engineer who taught him more about being a man than 51 years of success ever had. The cost of not looking is something you carry for a very long time. Stop walking so fast. Look left, look right, see the person on the steps. You have no idea what you might find when you finally do. To everyone watching today, if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs reminding that the world is made of people, not just progress. And if you have ever been the person on the steps seen by no one, passed by everyone, still sitting with your dignity intact, know that your presence matters more than the people walking past you will ever understand, until they stop. And they will stop. Eventually, they always stop.